Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is January 26, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to lecture number 1434. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s, and it was formally chartered in London by King George IV in 1824. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, which was the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses our sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your continuing support. If you are not yet a member, we suggest a one-time donation of 10,000 won or 10 US dollars. The full-time student rate is half of that amount, 5,000 won or $5. The donation page on your screen shows you PayPal or bank transfer information, and it's also been posted in the chat box. Now, having said that about a one-time donation, we'd much rather have you join us as members. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you unlimited access to our online events. Members receive discounts on RAS books, and you will also receive our annual journal, Transactions. See our website at raskb.com for details. A link is posted in the chat box. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. George Kallander from Syracuse University in the United States. Dr. Kallander is joining us at dark early, no small feat for a lot of us. We really appreciate your willingness to join us at this hour, George. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Kallander is the translator and annotator of the Diary of 1636, a classic in Korean literature from the mid-Chosun era. The diary was written by a court official in King In-jo's government of Chosun. The writer chronicles the 1636 Manchu, or later called Qing, invasion, King In-jo's retreat, and the siege at Namhan Mountain, which is southeast of Seoul. After King In-jo, subjugated himself and the kingdom to the Qing, this government official, Mr. Namhan Gap, went into forced retirement, where he continued to add to his diary, offering interesting insights on the king, court officials, and the changes that had taken place in the country. After the lecture, as always, there will be time for questions. So now, if you will please be sure that you're ready to go, we'll ask Dr. Kallander to take us away with the years of living dangerously.
Well, thank you, Steve, for the very kind introduction, and also for the chance to speak here at the Royal Asiatic Society. Also, thank you to everybody from around the world. Wow, what a strange and unusual time we're living in. Many opportunities, though, to meet and make friends with people like this. And it's my pleasure to have a chance to talk about my work. So thank you for joining me. It is a little early here, and yesterday, in the spirit of the talk, I did a little preparing for my breakfast. So I stopped by our local tous les jours and have my necessary sugar donut, the twisty kind that I'll have after my talk. But even though I'm in Syracuse, 4 hours northwest driving from New York City, I can still get my tous les jours. As Steve mentioned, my talk today is on my new book, and that's the Diary of 1636. I have a copy of it right here. I hope it's available in Korea and other places. And what I will do today is give a little background information about the the writer, the early 17th century, and describe a bit about some of the major themes that I find are important in this work and period. I'll provide some examples from the text, and I'll go off on some tangents a few times here and there, but then I'll pull it all together and try to sum up, and then give you ample time if you have any questions. I have a little PowerPoint that I'd like to set up right here. Rather than looking at me, you can look at the PowerPoint slide. I'm going to share my screen. I think that should be in order right now. So
Yep,
yes, I titled, that's
Looks
good, very good. All right, so yes, so I'm a professor at Syracuse University, and my field is early modern Korea. Specifically, I do Chosŏn. I started my career doing later Chosŏn, but I've moved back to this fascinating period now of the mid-Chosŏn, and what I think is a really important moment in Korea, East Asia, and even global history. So I'm going to read a little bit from my prepared notes here. And what I'd like to do first is explain the title, Years of Living Dangerously. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie, A Year of Living Dangerously. I've based the talk title on this movie. I think I was watching the movie or rewatching it when Steve asked me to give the talk. Minus the steamy love scenes between Sigourney Weaver and Mel Gibson, the movie in many ways resonated with me, thinking about the period of the early 17th century during this, the two Manchu wars, the two attacks against Korea, 1627 and 1637. Although these were two military attacks, you could also say there might be a third attack against Korea, and that was more metaphorical because the decline of the Ming and the rise of ultimately the Qing dynasty was an attack on the way the Koreans perceived their identity and sense of connections to China and regional ideas of culture and scholarship and all of this. So really there are two attacks, but we could consider this transitional moment a metaphorical attack. So like the movie, when I was watching the movie and ruminating about it again, like the movie, there are lots of, in the movie and in this moment, there are lots of small choices that people make in these great historical sweeping events taking place. So small choices can have unintended consequences and major repercussions also for you and the people connected to you and around you, and your country as well. There's and also no matter how much you struggle and how much you try, there's still certain historical forces that prevent you from carrying out what you hope and what you intend to do. Historical moments, larger international and domestic forces really are overpowering. In some ways, that's the unfolding of events at the beginning of the 17th century. It's all revealed here in the diary, Manangap's diary. Steve introduced the diary, and what I'd like to highlight is that this diary was written over a period of years. Some of it, the initial part, was written during the 1637 invasion, but then Namhan wrote other parts of it later. And so what is fascinating for me and what we should also focus on is what sort of message he was trying to convey to his readers, and what sort of story he was trying to tell about himself, the king, the court, and the country. All of the small events that these individuals were trying to make, major events, major decisions by the king and the country, really, they were really difficult for them to come to fruition because of the greater political and economic and cultural changes going on in Northeast Asia in the early 17th century. So the diary of 1636, it can be read as a narration of the Manchu invasion of Korea, but it's also part of the political and social aftermath of society here, Korea, at war. One of the arguments that I make is that there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface of the diary of this text. So it's not just simply a straightforward diary of the invasion, but it's also a discussion of the politics. It's a discussion about the affairs of the state. It's also a discussion about Na himself, and Na attempting to, in some ways, reconcile the situation where no matter how much he tried, he was unable to do more. So he's subtle and sometimes not so subtle in his critiques, especially of contemporary politics of the Chosŏn dynasty. So he uses structure, tone, and stories to narrate the attacks, also the political situation in Korea at this time. So he discusses decisions to go to war. He talks about this in this really bitter, acrimonious environment of politics at the court, factionalism, as it's often called in Korean history, and the consequences of this, because there's a lot of fallout after the war as well, too. Many people lose their jobs, many people lose their lives. Some people are expelled from the center. Na himself is expelled from Seoul and ends up in exile, where he finishes the diary. So in the diary, it's not simply a discussion of the war, but it's also a discussion about himself in his own place in the events unfolding around him and in Korea. And what he concludes is that this war was disastrous in many different ways. Not only was it disastrous for Korea, but it also fractured ties, both at the larger level, the international level, also fractured loyalties at the more intimate and small scale level. There are a lot of people who not only were unsure about how to respond to the Manchu, but there's some Koreans who begrudgingly understood the change of political situation in Northeast Asia and wanted to sever ties with the Ming and return to a relationship with the Manchu. So all of this takes place in the period of really what is a tumultuous year, or years, so years of living dangerously. In particular, the period from 1627 to 1637. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this period, but I'm going to give just a little bit of background. In the early 17th century, Northeast Asia was undergoing this major shift in power dynamics. You had in mainland China, you had the decline of the Ming, and in Northeast Asia, and what we call also Manchuria, we have the rise of the Jurchens, who changed their names to the Manchu and become the Qing. Also in Japan, we have the end of a very ambitious empire at the end of the 16th century. And then in the 17th century, we have complete turnaround, an era that ushers in great peace under the Tokugawa. And Korea too was undergoing these major shifts during this period. It's recovering from the devastating Imjin War that Japan unleashed against it in the late 16th century, which the Ming came to the Korean Peninsula and helped Korea defeat the Japanese. In the aftermath of this major war at the end of the 16th, Korea underwent many, many reforms, just like its neighbors. There was a slow expansion of a new tax policies to help rationalize the economy and rebuild in the devastation of the war. And this would inevitably be very transformational for Korea, these changes to the economy into the 18th century. There'd be great social expansion into the 18th and 19th century, for instance. Also, there was some military reforms because there was recognition at the court of the failures of the Korean army to defend the country against the Japanese. And so there was discussion and some implementations of reforms in the military leading into the 17th century. But again, despite all of the best efforts that the Chosun court was attempting to take, much of it was consumed by this growing international storm between the Ming and the Manchu. And, you know, connecting it back to the years of living dangerously then, one of the major themes is this, that despite the best effort of the Korean court to implement reforms and change, they were unable to fulfill the desire to strengthen themselves militarily in particular against a rising external threat. So, and it's most indicative in these two Manchu attacks of 1627 and 1636. All of this took place in the context of actions and missteps over a number of years, even decades. That includes major dangers. The Chosun court, understandably, very much aligned with the Ming, not only for the Ming support of Korea during the Imjin War, has a very big part of it, part of the story, but also for the the perception of the Ming dynasty as the harbinger of Chinese civilization. So at many different levels, the Chosun admire and support the Ming. But one of the elements of the rise of the Ming and the decline of the Ming and the rise of the Manchu is the decline of Ming military power to help Chosun overcome these possible threats. Inevitably, by the 17th century, the beginning of the 17th century, we start to see the rise of a powerful state that challenges the Ming and also comes to challenge Chosun militarily and in many ways psychologically Korea. Na understood some of these. So the writer of the diary understood a lot of what's going on. You know, Korea was very much in tune with the changes taking place apart from internally, but also across its frontiers. And what we see here is this, a number of incidents, minor incidents that inevitably have major repercussions for Korea. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these repercussions, but in the interest of also giving some details, I'm going to read some parts of my diary that I've translated to highlight and give some examples, vivid examples of the observations that Na is making during this time, you know, between 1627 and 1636 and 37 too. And also I'll explain these moments a little better. But what I'd like to suggest here is that Na understood, and other Koreans understood, that in 1636, the problem was beyond control of the Korean state. Some of these were very small snubs that Na recognizes as some of the things that helped carry out and lead to the eventual Manchu attacks of 1637. Na writes, in the early spring of Pyōngjarok year, 1636, military officer of the sub-prefect Yi-gwak and Na Tok-hyun, a fifth minister, traveled to Mukden in Manchuria as envoys. On the 11th day of the third lunar month was the day Hong Taiji, the Manchu Jin dynasty, he took over the title of emperor. Na writes, the Manchu ordered the envoys, against their will, he pointed out, to take part in the congratulatory procession. But risking death, they did not obey. The barbarian official seized Gwak and others with force, damaging their clothes and caps, but the envoys never surrendered. Among the Chinese people, generally the Ming, who were observing this, they shed tears. When it was time for the envoys, Kwok and the others, to return to Chosun, Hong Taiji, the Manchu emperor, gave them a state letter. In this letter, Hong Taiji designated himself as emperor. Kwok and others took it, this letter, wrapped it in black cloth, secretly put it in a sack, and returned towards the Chosun frontier. At the Chosun frontier, Kwok and others came upon a Manchu squad, a Churchian squad, guards who searched them. Kwok, the Korean envoy, made an excuse that his horse was ill and that the load was too heavy, and he left his sack with the state letter with the barbarian guards along the frontier. Well, to Na and others, this was a huge error on the part of these envoys. Na and others blamed this official for not only receiving this letter from Hong Taiji, but also leaving it at the border and not bringing it back, breaking protocols, several protocols here. Right? So on their way back, Hong gets into a lot of trouble. And Na points this out in the diary as one of those small instances that eventually will lead up to this major invasion of Korea in 1637. Another small snub Na points out in the diary involves two Manchu military generals. Okay, so on the one hand, you have these small snubs that to the Koreans don't seem very significant, but to the Manchu are very astute, and they're taking note of the Korean response, especially after 1627, because after 1627, the Koreans have withdrawn from their original alliance with the Manchu and have returned to their pro-Ming stance. So the period between 1627 and 1637, where Korea is hemming and hawing between supporting the Ming and supporting the Manchu again, Korean court realigns with the Ming. And so the Manchu are understandably upset. So Na describes another small incident involving two Manchu military generals who come to Korea. And they're there to pay reverence to the Queen Dowager Inmok, who has passed away. All right. So at the time, Na writes, the two Manchu generals were allowed to enter the royal palace earlier and give sacrifices, but this time the Korean court, decided to give an excuse. They did not want the Manchu generals present at the royal palace. The palace was too crowded, they blamed, and so they separated the Manchu away from the palace. They gave them some empty tents across the bridge, safer distance, the court considered a safer distance, but still allowing the Manchu to come and conduct sacrifices for the Queen Dowager Inmok. But it was during this moment, one of these small incidents, again, that inevitably lead up to war between the Manchu and the Koreans, is that, well, the wind blew at this moment, opening the tent flap, and inside the Manchu generals could see out, and what they saw angered them. They saw a squad of Chosun Korean military troops training with muskets, and this frightened the Manchu, angered the Manchu. And so the barbarian envoys broke out of their tent and they left the city. They were angered by another snub, diplomatic snub, but here it has military undertones. From the Manchu perspective, the Manchu feel the Koreans are threatening them. These two very senior Manchu military generals are being threatened. Well, the Manchu leave Seoul and angered, they return up to Manchuria. And Na writes that those in the paths and roads who witnessed the retreat of the Manchu were shocked and frightened. And the children at the village gates and alleyways, They competed in falling over each other in eagerness, throwing stones at them. But this is a real indication that relations between the Manchu and the Chosun was falling off. So these are two diplomatic snubs. And two of these snubs like these at this level have real political and military consequences, especially in this major break in relations between Korea and the Manchu. Namhan narrates a few other larger decisions that had major consequences on the dynasty in the early 17th century, especially this realignment that Korea made from the Ming, from the Qing back to the Ming. So this shift in power and the rise of the Manchu and decline of the Qing. Well, the Manchu have designs to invade China, right? The Manchu first attacked in order to get to China, traditionally powerful states in Northeast Asia, first deal with Korea. And the Manchu had done that in 1627, launching an attack against the Chosun in 1627 that really shook the dynasty. Dynasty quickly was overpowered, and the king and court was captured and realigned with the Ming. Broke off with the Ming, sorry, and realigned with the Qing, 1627. But however, as soon as the Manchu left in 1627, the court realigned with the Ming. Understandably, this angered the Manchu, who had designs on China. But as I said, traditionally, these Northeast Asian states will first attack Korea to force Korea to sever relations with China. It's for defensive purposes. It's also for symbolic purposes. Because these states in Northeast Asia, generally they have ambitions to become dynasties themselves and empires, and in order to be an empire and a dynasty, you need to have vassal states, or you need to have tributary states, and Korea would be one of those, and most likely the most important one of those. So in 1627, you had an attack, Manchu attack. It was really rapid. The Manchu troops overpower Korean soldiers and capture Seoul and Gangwa Island, and they force Korea to cut relations with the Ming. And in 1627, as part of this formality, King Injo swears an allegiance of friendship with the great Jin Manchu dynasty. Okay, 1627. And in order to underscore the importance of this alliance, the surrender ritual in 1627 is very elaborate. So in 1627, what happens is that the oath is made over a sacrificial horse and black ox, and in front of a number of Chosun officials, Manchu envoys, and also some Chinese generals. The King Injo swears allegiance to the Manchu in 1627, and also promises them that they will behave. Well, as I said, as soon as the Manchu forces withdrew north, thinking the issue was solved, the Chosun court severed relations with the Manchu and returned their allegiance to the Ming. So they broke their pledge, and Manchu troops again would invade in 1636 and 1637. So also, in addition to this, we get the return of a larger army, eventually in 1636 and 1637, to punish Chosun dynasty for breaking the 1627 oath. And so, unlike 1627, 1636, 1637, it's a much more powerful Manchu army, led by Manchu generals. Also, in addition to Manchu troops, there are also Mongol soldiers fighting, and they're very brutal. And they have a very bad reputation for their brutality. They attack again in 1636 and 1637. So the remember, so the Joseon court was very eager to sever relations with the Manchu after 1627 and realign with the Ming. But Joseon really had a hard time struggling with the second Manchu response in 1637. Militarily, they could not find a way to stop the Manchu and Mongol armies fighting them. Granted, few people did, right? Certainly the Ming, the all-powerful Ming, could not. But Korea here searched for ways to defend themselves. So traditionally, the court retreats to Gangwa Island. The king, as he did in 1627 and also in earlier times, but the Manchu know this and they strike very quickly, and they are so rapid that they cut off the retreat for the king. So instead of going to Gangwa Island, the King Injo is forced to go to Namhan Mountain Fortress. The king, the crown prince, other military and civilian officials, and also Namangap are forced to retreat south of the capital to Namhan. And this is problematic. Namhan was very well fortified. Namhan never fell. Unlike Gangwa Island, the Manchu captured again in 1637. Namhan was sieged. The Manchu attacked, but unable to overcome the defenses because of terrain, for instance. But also this had problems for the Korean court too, because it was very chaotic, the situation in 1637. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this chaos. So getting messages in and out of Namhan was very difficult, especially military orders. The Manchu surrounded Namhan Fortress in most places, and few Koreans could get in and out. So there was very little military coordination among leaders around the country, especially in the Northwest, and with the Chosun court. Also, the Korean defenses at the time were, I think Namhan is a great example of the kind of defenses that Koreans put up. Retreating to mountain fortresses to once the enemy had gathered or passed by, retreating, coming out of these mountain fortresses, attacking from the rear. But the Manchu knew this defense, and so had a very capable way of getting around these. Just simply go around these mountain fortresses, and also those with large military numbers like Namhan surround them and attack them. So the Manchu were unable to capture Namhan Mountain Fortress, but they were able to quickly overcome the defenses on Gangwa Island. Gangwa Island, as I said, was a traditional place where the Korean court retreated when foreigners from the north invaded. But the Manchu had this time in 1637, they had two seasoned Ming Chinese generals who had shifted sides from the Ming to the Manchu, and they're very skilled at amphibious warfare. So the Manchu were very easily able to overcome the defenses on Gangwa Island, cross the waters to get to Gangwa, and overcome the defenses on Gangwa Island. And this is a major consequence for the Korean court, because Gangwa Island is where the wife of the crown prince and other high members of the royal family, and also the Sadebu, the capital elite, were had retreated to. I'm going to give you a few examples of the military situation that Na writes about in his diary. Na writes, quote, "That morning, military general Yi Hung-gup was first dispatched with roughly 80 cavalry units to go and confront the enemy." This is early in the war. "As they were saying their farewells and leaving, they drank too much of the rice wine bestowed by His Highness and the farewell drinks from their relatives and friends." So this guard troop celebrated with the king in Namhan Mountain Fortress, and then they were going out to attack the enemy. Well, Na writes that from the guard officer all the way down, so nearly everybody in the squad, there was no one who was not intoxicated. They arrived outside of Namhan at the hills of Chosŏn-Ming, climbed towards the frontier, and the enemy annihilated them, and only a few survived. Another example of the military situation here. Na writes, quote, in hand-to-hand combat, if you were provided with a lot of gunpowder, you just use it all up. So they had to conserve their gunpowder. If gunpowder was given out on a case-by-case basis, then you would hear people shouting for gunpowder while they're out there on the battlefield doing hand-to-hand combat. And when troops from both sides fought each other and they fought hand-to-hand, there was no interludes requesting more gunpowder, only fighting with empty guns. Without gunpowder and bullets, the enemy could not be stopped. The mountain roads were very steep, so our troops could not ascend quickly while withdrawing to the fortress. In the end, our troops were annihilated. The Supreme Commander witnessed the defeat and the annihilation of our soldiers. He began to give orders to one company commander to wave the flag and signal for retreat. However, the top and bottom parts of Namhan Fortress were separated by gates, so they couldn't see each other. And so Na describes how chaos ensued on the battlefield, and in the end, their soldiers were wiped out. Na writes about his own experience at Namhan Mountain Fortress, but in the later sections of the diary, as we pointed out earlier, he tells the story of the battle from different perspectives, largely from notes and personal interviews that he used later after the war. So in one of these sections, he describes incidents on Gangwa Island. And I'd like to read an example of the military situation on Gangwa. Quote, when the enemy first crossed the river, one of our military officers sank one of the enemy vessels and wanted to move forward and fight. But one of them, Zhang Xin, struck a gong to signal retreat instead. So everybody withdrew and returned to the island. At first, the enemy had suspected an ambush. Then they hesitated and did not send out any boats. Then one enemy vessel approached Gangwa, engaged in battle, and landed on the other side, on the riverbank. And from that boat, 7 enemy soldiers gained a foothold ashore. They did this without firing an arrow. And they each grasped their swords, moved along the riverbank without any horses, traveled north and scampered up the hill to a lookout. And from there, they signaled their comrades on the other side of the waters, the safety and the capture of the riverbank. And from then onward, the waterway was filled with enemy ships. So Na points out some of the failures of the military situation here, and also the chaos of the war. The Manchu arrived on Gangwa almost unchallenged. Despite the gallant individual efforts of many Korean soldiers and also officers, without coordination, the Chosun army really disintegrates. Also on Gangwa Island, there's a real big snake on Gangwa Island. His name is Kim Kyung-jin. Kim Kyung-jin ultimately is blamed for the capture of Gangwa Island. Kim Kyung-jin was a high official delegated with the defenses of Gangwa Island. And Na writes about some of the examples of Kim's failures to protect Gangwa Island from the Manchu. Na writes, because the leader Chang Xin, who was this earlier military officer, was not with his soldiers, there was uncertainty about what to do. And Kim Kyung-jin, the officer in charge of defenses, didn't know what to do. So he rushed to the harbor, abandoned his horse, and waded into the water where he boarded a boat to flee. So you can see here that Na is narrating the situation where leaders like Kim Kyung-jin and Chang Xin, they forego defending the island out of selfishness. They even leave their mothers, Na writes. Kim Kyung-jin and Chang Xin leave their mothers in the Gangwa Island Fortress so that these two men can escape. And inevitably, their mothers die in the war. It's really telling, these examples. There's very little military coordination among these high officials. The idea of horses are important here, whether their Manchu soldiers don't have horses, so they're defenseless. Or here we have Kim Kyung-jin getting off his horse, which is basically surrendering to the enemy. So it's these major situations that ultimately lead to the collapse of the Chosun defenses and the surrender of the state. I have just a few more examples that I would like to give. Some of the themes, though, that I also focus on in this book are important to understand what Na is doing, and also the situation in 1637. It's not only a military battle taking place, but it's also an epistolary battle, something that I argue. So this is a war fought between the Manchu and the Chosun with the brush, right, and paper. So yes, the two armies fight, but also the two courts send dozens and dozens of letters back and forth to each other. The Manchu are trying to convince the Koreans to surrender, while the Chosun are trying to convince the Manchu to understand the situation of Chosun, that they had made a mistake, and ultimately to withdraw the Manchu forces, and after which the Chosun would realign with the Manchu. I'm going to read one of these letters to give you a sense of the kind of correspondence between the Manchu emperor and also the Korean king, King Injo. Really highly formulaic and stylistic letters that ultimately lead to really descriptive letters that the Manchu send. And you're going to sense here some anger. So the Manchu emperor, in one situation, writes a very lengthy letter. There are many long letters. When I was translating this, it was a not easy task. But one of them is a very lengthy letter that the Manchu emperor is present in Korea. This is another example of the importance of this battle to the Manchu. Unlike in 1627, 1637, we have high Manchu leadership, even the emperor himself, guiding their armies. So the Manchu emperor, in one of the final letters, basically the last straw, if you don't surrender, this is what's going to happen. So the Manchu emperor Hong Taiji writes, "I carefully considered the oath taken in 1627. So even though Namhan barely mentions the 1627, the breaking of the oath in 1627, so from the Korean perspective, they don't really bring this up. But the Manchu are really focused on this 1627. Why did you, on the one hand, promise us that you would enter into this alliance, but then immediately renege and realign with the Ming?" So Hong Taiji wants to know, says he's carefully considered the oath taken in 1627. He's repeatedly enlightened you, King Injo, when your country contemplating breaking the oath. You were not afraid of heaven. You did not want to save the commoners who were in distress, and you turned against the oath first. My envoy, General Ingleday, got a hold of your letters from your subjects along the frontier. From that, we began to realize that your country was planning war. I used to tell your two Chosun envoys and also merchants, quote, "Your country is rude like this. We will invade your country soon. You can return to inform your king, King Injo, and everybody under him to the commoners, unquote. Hong Taiji goes on, the information we gave them is clear and we sent it to you. So there's no treachery involved in the way I mobilize my army. So I prepared a letter for those envoys to take back to you, but you threw it away. And you violated the oath of 1627. So, and that violation of the oath violates heaven's promises. Hong Taiji writes, if I disobeyed an oath, I would be really afraid of being punished by heaven. Because it's true that you betrayed the oath, calamity struck your country. How can you be like someone who is innocent and without any connections, yet so far-fetched in the idea of what you have carried out? Hong Taiji says, you wrote, quote, our small country, Chosŏn, is located in one corner of a remote sea. We still strive to follow the book of songs and book of classics. We're a very Confucian country, and we're very unfamiliar with war, King Injo said. Hong Taiji says in response, well, really, you don't know war? In 1619, when Chosun army supported the Ming troops in attacking the Manchu in Manchuria, without cause, you invaded our lands, right? And Hong Taiji says, I believe your country is very familiar with military affairs, and you provoked us, and you're fighting now. And so your troops are growing very experienced and seasoned. So he says, do you still insist that you're unfamiliar with military affairs? And Hong Taiji thinks Chosun is very familiar with military matters. Other situations as well too. But what we have here are a number of letters exchanged between the two, where the battle is not just on the battlefield, it's also through the brush. And ultimately, the Korean court is forced to surrender to the Manchu. So Hong Taiji's letters like this demonstrate this level of anger that the Manchus have for King Injo and Chosŏn. The court had severed the 1627 pact, and there is going to be real consequences in the eyes of the Manchu for these small diplomatic snubs that I talked about earlier, and this major realignment that Korea did after 1627, going back to the Ming. So through these letters, the Manchu and the Koreans fought over interpretations and messages. I'm going to wrap up pretty soon. So what we see here is the military. So Chosun military and epistle battles. Eventually, it's a military defeat for Korea. Court surrenders after the capture of Gangwa, because on Gangwa Island, there were members of the royal family. You have the wife of the crown prince, many members of the royal family and Sadebu elites. And this war, finally, Chosun agreed to sever relations with the Ming and enter into permanent relations with the Manchu. These also included hostages that the Manchu demanded this time, sending hostages north. They were the crown prince's wife, other members of the royal family, children of the elite families, some of them forced to marry into Manchu elite families once they get into Manchuria. And also, most problematically, part of the surrender was the construction of a monument. And the monument of the surrender site. And in this monument, the Manchu tell their side of the story of Korea's, for the Manchu belief, duplicity in reneging on the 1627 agreement. One final thing I would like to say is the Manchu wars of 1627, 1636, they were very different from the kind of war that we saw in the end of the 16th century. So the Imjin War, the country was completely united against the Japanese. It wasn't exactly the case in the 1620s and 1630s. The 1620s and 1630s was much more complicated because although a lot of the court and officials were against the Manchu, there were those military and other court officials who recognized the shifting dynamics in Northeast Asia. And there were some Koreans who supported the Manchu. There were even some Koreans in 1627 who were part of the Manchu armies who came in 1620s. So in the 1620s and 1630s, there was a lot of uncertainty about what choice to make. In 1637 too, even around in the court around King Injo, there were pro-Manchu Korean officials who wanted to sever relations with the Ming and realign with the Manchu. So what you see here is this question of loyalty. And Na writes about this. That's also one of the major underlying themes of his diary, is the question of loyalty. Loyalties are fractured, they are malleable, and also at all levels of society. So from the loyalty between the Chosŏn and the Ming, Chosŏn and the Qing, also loyalties among government officials to the king himself. There's a whole other issue about following King Injo, because King Injo had come to the throne by a few points of other Confucians illegally, right, through a coup. Why not follow the other king, right, who was the legitimate king of Chosŏn court? All of these are raised in the diary. And just one final thought before I end. So there are a lot of lessons that we can take away. One of the things that I like to do as a history professor is to show the importance of history to present affairs, right? So even the era of the 17th century, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from Namhan Mountain diary, Korean experience with the Manchu and the Ming in the early 17th century. But one I'd like to leave you with here is a lesson of resilience, right? Yes, so I do narrate, and Na does describe many horrendous moments of Korean experience fighting and trying to defend their country against the attacking Manchu and also Mongol armies. The humiliation of severing relations with the Ming and entering into this relationship with the Manchu. But ultimately, Korea survives. In Joseon Dynasty, in the aftermath, experiences a period of intense political, military, and social upheaval. But then you have major social and economic growth into the 18th century once the relationship stabilizes with the Qing dynasty. So the lesson here is resilience. And we can keep this in mind in this era of COVID, that, you know, in the short term, things look bleak, but in the long run, they're all going to work out. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
George, we're delighted. Thank you. Folks, if you're not familiar with Zoom, at least on the PC version, there's a way to get to the participants window. And in the bottom corner of the participants window is a little function that says raise hand. Now, I don't know how that works on a Mac, and what do I want to say? Smartphone options, the menus come out quite a bit differently too sometimes. But I've already got, I don't know. We'll just start. I've got raised hands. If you don't have video function, if you can't find that out, type a note, a question in the chat box. We'll try to get to everybody. But last time we ran out of time before we got through half of them. So some of you may understand the challenges. I want to say something about this book. If you haven't read it yet, it's an absolutely fascinating insight into Korea of the time. And George, your prose in your English translation of it is just absolutely a dream to read. It's just good to read. And I'm just super amazed because this diary was not written in Hangul. It was written in court Chinese,
Yes,
which
that's
was
right.
common in Korea during Chosun Dynasty, and and I suspect even Chinese characters have modified somewhat over the years too, and so you're dealing with an ancient or an older style. Wow, what a tremendous work. George's notes alone in the first 100 or so pages are worth the price of the book. But if you don't read the rest of it, you've missed out. Go to Amazon, wherever, to find that book. It's well worth the read. I'm going to call on Russell Kelly for a question. Go ahead and unmute, Russ, and ask away.
Okay, yeah, look, I have a bit of an attachment to Gangwa Island. I lived there for 3 years and I explored it quite thoroughly. And now I just wonder why, you know, in the Goryeo dynasty, they held out for nearly 40 years against the Mongols. And
Yes.
it's an easy place to defend. They had 3 layers of defense, the outer along the shoreline, and then a middle one, which not many people know about, which were earthen banks, and then the central one, which was the main city. Now, all those were destroyed under the orders of the Mongols once Goryeo submitted to the Mongol rule. So they must have rebuilt all that for the Joseon dynasty then to put their royalty back onto Gangwa Island to seek safety. And second to that is, how the hell did they breach the Gangwa defences when the only time you can attack that island is at high tide for the very short time between in and out tides? That's my question.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I have to say, it's great to know that you're familiar with Gangwa. I remember, you know, I have studied the Mongol era as well. That's part of my scholarship and my scholarly interests. So when I was a graduate student, I do recall, you know, reading about all the history behind it, and then taking buses, local buses, finally getting out to these sites in Gangwa Island, getting dropped off. It's just a field. There's nothing there. All these royal palaces and all this have been destroyed. So yes, they have largely, from the Goryeo era, been leveled. In 1627 and 1636, though, situation is a little more, I think, has evolved. The Mongols, the traditional answer for the Mongols issue is, though the Mongols have learned their fighting skills and on the steppe where there's really no need for amphibious warfare. I don't know if I completely buy that. Largely, I think in the Mongol era, I think the Mongols were happy with the Che family and the royal house on Gangwa Island doing what they needed to do, because they were not a threat to the Yuan and the Mongol. So the Mongols had bigger fish to catch. Inevitably, they're very happy once the court returned to the peninsula in the 13th century. But now what we have here in the 17th century, we have a very different sort of military power. The Manchu is not necessarily only a steppeland power, but also it's more of a amalgamation of soldiers with various skills, generals, various backgrounds, and also you have seasoned and experienced leadership, Chinese, you know, Han Chinese, Ming officials, Ming generals who have switched sides, and they're giving their experience to the Manchu armies in Korea. Even those 2 Chinese generals are in Korea leading the strike force against the Gangwa Island. But from what I understand, it's more of a situation of simplicity. The Koreans do not put up a defense against the Manchu soldiers who, in one section of the diary in the description is that they use makeshift boats to cross Gangwa waters to get to Gangwa Island. So it seems to be more of we can say fortune and heaven for them to be able to find the material there along the shores to get in. They didn't bring their boats with them, of course. They commandeered Korean craft to load their troops into and get to the other side. But how could they overcome the defenses? Is largely because there were no real defenses against the Manchu. I do believe, I really have this belief that in the 13th century, if the Mongols had coordinated attacks against Gangwa Island with Song generals and others, like they had prepared to do in the 1280s against Japan. And the only reason that they didn't invade the Japanese islands was because of the typhoons. The Mongols would have overcome the defenses on Gangwa Island, even in the 13th century. But I just think they didn't care about them that much, so left them. But for the Manchu had to force the Korean court to surrender, because it wasn't just a military situation in 1637. It was a question of identity. The Manchu and the Hong Taiji wanted to be an emperor. So to be an emperor, he had to force Korea to enter into this this sort of tributary relationship, for lack of a better word. And he was hell-bent on punishing Korea for their 1627. Maybe the 1627 incident is the real reason why the Manchu leadership launched that attack against Gangwa to punish Korea.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, there seemed to be a lack of will to resist, perhaps.
Lack of will. Very few people could have resisted the Manchu Qing armies in the beginning of the 7th century. So, yeah, and when you read the diary, if you have a chance to, you see many examples of Koreans bravely fighting against the Manchu, but because of lack of military preparations, coordinations, even something coming down to fodder for animals, there's a shortage everywhere. And so there's an inability to put up sustained defense against. There's a lot of, well, we should have done this and it would have gone this way. But in reality, who can say what would have happened?
Yeah. George, there's a question about the monument that you mentioned.
Oh, yes.
Is that the one that is presently located in the Chamsil area? And
Daebonam?
What?
Yes. It's the monument about the subservience of the Chosun to the Manchu Qing. Yes, that's what it's undergone some various stages of historical rethinking. Even at one point, I think part of it was thrown in the river,
right?
In the hot river. Understandably, considering what Korea had to go through.
Yeah.
After that, so it was a symbol that the Manchu totally understood. It was a symbol of humiliation for the Chosun, and a reminder. In 1627, the Manchu didn't leave this behind. They made this oath with Chosun in 1627. Chosun returned to their alliance with the Ming, and so in 1637, the Manchu leadership wanted to force Chosun to remember this moment. And so the Chosun was forced to make this as part of this reminder for the Korean court and others, whoever saw it, of this moment in 1637.
Yep. I'm going to go to John Jackson. John, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I'm probably way off base on this. My knowledge of Korean history is very spotty. But I guess a couple of years ago, I was on the West Coast taking some photos of sunset, and I turned around and there was this, well, very impressive lava stone wall. And there was a historical marker there. I went over and read it, and it said this was a portion of the original wall that was built to defend Jeju Island from, I guess, the Mongol invasion. And it's one of those moments. I think some historian in Greece supposedly had a moment that he knew history so well that he actually revisited that moment in history. And I mean, seriously, whether you believe that's possible. I didn't have that experience, of course, but I had a little glimmer when I saw that wall and I turned around and looked at the coastline there. I couldn't imagine how any invasion force could have come into Jeju Island at that point, why there would have been a wall there. And it kind of made me a little interested in that. And the same year, there was a musical festival, and I always make the musical festivals. And as it turned out, it was at the spot where they had made the last stand, I guess, inland from the coast. And there's a historical spot, and I never knew, well, I knew about it, but I never visited, but I went there for the musical festival. And when I was there, there were the flags flapping in the Jeju wind, and I got a little bit of that feeling that, yeah, I could almost imagine, you know, being here when these Mongol invasion happened, and these people were here making the last stand. It's kind of like the Alamo to defend their nation, even though it's hopeless. So it was a really kind of powerful experience, even though I wasn't there for historical reasons whatsoever. And one other question, which I was just curious about, Chosun dynasty was, you know, a Neo-Confucian nation or whatever. And, you know, the I Ching is so important in Neo-Confucianism. And originally the I Ching, as I understand it, and have read a little bit about the first inscriptions, you know, on the turtle shells, they were always asking about the king was going here, and if he goes here for this hunt or to attack someone, would it be successful? And I've never come across anything from the Chosun dynasty when people asked or consulted the I Ching, and when these invasions happened in Korea, did the leaders ask their I Ching philosophers or whatever to consult and give some kind of advice? Should we flee to Konghwa-do, or should we just fold and hope for, you know, better times down the road? But I've never come across anything like that. And you might know if there's something like that in Korean history that's recorded in Korean, or even better, translated. I don't imagine there's anything like that translated. But, you know, today I almost wish that there was a Facebook back then so we could actually see and know what happened at that time, because it's so intriguing to me when I just run into these little situations where I feel I'm there for a moment in history that's passed by. So you know much more about this than me. So
Those are great comments, John. I really do like islands in Korea, you know, and so when you travel to places like Jeju Island, you get a sense of how Jeju, how Mongols were attracted to Jeju, especially for their the pasture lands and the horses. But you know, the I Ching was very important in Korea then and now. You know, even though you might not see it, but it ideas of the I Ching permeate Korean way of thinking, and even an idea of so consulting books like the I Ching. It was largely, connected to omens and portents of nature around you, like famine and appearance of comments or things like that. And books like the I Ching speak to some of those points. So even though you might not see it, but it's there underneath. Thank you, John.
Yep. Great, thank you. Igor, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Mr.
Thank you.
Kallander. So I got a question about Namhan Gap as an official. So he, amongst this uprising, turmoil, and war. So how I understand your presentation, that he was an official of high rank, that he was around the king most of the time, right? So so this is the first part of my question. What rank was he? Yeah, so mid, low, high, or he was just a passerby? And then so Namhan Gap is an official. So what did he record about changes to Korean state officialdom in general, before and after Manchu invasion of 36? So, for example, before the invasion, we were wearing this and that attire, but after Manchus, they ordered us to change hats or whatever, yeah? So, and did the Manchu dynasty or Qing dynasty later, did they enforce any kind of changes to official system of Korea? Like, for example, ABC, before the war, there were ABC types of official, yeah? A being the highest, B being mid-tier, and C, local officials. And did the Manchus, for the betrayal of 36, decide that officials of A rank have to go and just leave the B and C tier, if you understand what I mean? So, and last thing, did the Manchu subjugation by the Manchu change the system of officialdom from meritocratic, being Confucian, to inherited? Or was it inherited before? And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Igor. It's nice. Thank you. These are wonderful questions. I'll go through them just quickly. Namhan Gap was initially a lower level official, one of those little bit on the outside of the Yangban power, who rises up from taking the examinations, and his position as a tutor and also as a diarist bring him in close proximity to the king. And for instance, Namhan Gap is in the court in 1627 when King Enjo initially flees to Gangwa Island. He has a bit of a rocky road, just as many other officials do, because of the nature of politics in Chosun at the time. Is really reflected through factionalism, and he has gets the attention of one of the opposing factions who constantly want to try to push him out of power. But he is not a high-ranking official. He's not one of those, he doesn't come from one of these high families who are in powerful positions. He happened to be where he was at the time, largely because of fate, right? Largely, he was a low, then mid-ranking official who recorded the events around him. Number two, change. I think 2, 3, and 4, your questions kind of overlap. So I'm going to just try to give a little bit context here. The Manchu and the Qing really want to return to, they don't force Korea to change. They force Korea to exert allegiance in different ways. They force Korea to send hostages, right? They force Korea to some of the families to intermarry. However, they are not interested in controlling Korean government. There's no instance, from what I know, from what I have seen, of the Qing government getting overly involved in Chosun politics, except until the late 19th century, when you have the period from 1884, 85 to 1894, 1895, when you have high Qing official, I think, serving in the Chosun treasury, trying to lead policy. But generally, the Qing want to focus their attentions elsewhere. From the Korean perspective, though, this is really mind-boggling and life-changing because, yes, there's a split at the court and other officials in 1636, 1637. Should we support the Ming? Should we support the Qing? Inevitably, the Chosŏn begin to support the Qing, but there is like a falling out among these two groups. And ultimately, there's, beginning with Na in many ways, there's a desire to create a sense of martyrdom and create the sense of loyalty. Those officials who were loyal to the Ming should be revered in many ways. But all of this takes place within Korea, right? The Manchu, the Qing doesn't really have, is not aware of the Chosun courts. Diplomatically, they follow the Qing, but internally, the pro-Ming, the pro-Manchu royal family members who eventually return from their exile, from their hostage situation in Manchuria, pro-Manchu officials, they are suppressed, right? The crown prince who returns is he's Catholic in many ways, people say, and also he is more pro-Manchu. He ends up dead, and so there's a realignment in the court and politics away from any potentially outwardly pro-Manchu officials to a begrudging acceptance of this relationship, but a clear indication that Korean elites now into the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, they want to go their own way, right? So this is the part where you see the rise of, Koreans looking at Korea to develop scholarship and interest in things around them. So in short, no, the Manchu don't step in to force Korea to change. They force Korea to accept the diplomatic protocols that any dynasty would demand of Korea, like the acceptance of the Qing reign year, right? The emperor. So internal documents, diplomatic relations that have to correspond to the Qing reign year. Internally, Koreans try to continue to use the Ming, which is another story. Those are the Manchu also demanded the Chosun give back the Ming vestige titles. So what the Qing wanted to do was to push the Ming aside and replace the Ming as Korea's center. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to go to Jacko. Jacko Setzlot, please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, can I be heard?
You can be heard.
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. So my question is about Quan-Wu worship in Qing China. We know that after the Hideyoshi invasions or the Imjin Wars, the Ming made, they set up their own little altars to Quan-Wu or Quan-Yu, as he's known in Chinese. Did the Qing, were they offended by that? Did they tear down the Quan-Wu shrines that they found in Korea, or were they also into Quan-Wu?
Slightly,
Chinese god of war.
Yeah, there was slightly. There was some ritual practice around Quan-Wu. I think this gets back to also the previous question, is that the Qing, apart from this, diplomatic the rituals around diplomacy, the ritual relationship between Korea and Chosun, between Chosun and the Qing, it's at the level of ritual largely, and the Manchu wanted those changed from the Ming to the Qing. Otherwise, the Chosun was left to their own devices to govern themselves. There were some requirements, but and Manchu officials arrived at times But it was very highly formalized sort of visits. So you just didn't have a Manchu, you know, stumbling upon these sites in the countryside. They were relegated to a certain path, and they were relegated to a certain part of Seoul. So they didn't really have an opportunity to get out and see any of these situations. So yeah, the simple question, simple answer would be no. The Qing did not force Korea to change their patterns of governance or religious worship or philosophies. The Koreans did it themselves, understanding that this idea of Chinese center, the Ming, and what it meant to revere China was now broken, because the revered Ming, who had helped save Korea from the Japanese, been the harbingers of, you know, Chinese culture, well, were defeated now by barbarians. So those who came to power after 1630 never accepted. They begrudgingly, you know, worked with the Qing, but they looked inward. They began looking inward. So the Koreans did it themselves. What they did was they started, you know, new forms of scholarship, new forms of self-identity. There's a growth in vernacular literature and the vernacularization of culture from the 17th and 18th century onward. Thank you.
Okay.
Echo.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ken Fox, please. Ken, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I watched lots of Korean historical dramas, and I've seen portrayed in two different dramas when King Injo was compelled to kowtow to the emperor, to the Manchu emperor. Is that described in the diary, and could you elaborate on what happened?
Ken, yes, it is. That's a great moment in the diary. It's very descriptive. I first have to say, you know, I tried to keep up on all of these Korean dramas, and it's just so hard to do. There's so many great ones out there now. So this is one of my shortfalls. I think I have Namhan Mountain, right, the movie. But yes, there is a huge debate at the court, and Na describes it in the diary about surrendering to the Qing, what form of surrender ritual, but inevitably the surrender in front of the Manchu emperor, officials, and you know, the Han's tent set up there. So yeah, it's a pretty dramatic moment in the diary. And what Na narrates and describes is it's extremely humiliating. It's a humiliating moment for the Korean king and officials to enter into this relationship. You get the sense, though, from the Manchu side is that the Manchu are angry at the Koreans. They are angry at Korea for reneging in 1627, putting them in this situation. But they are looking for Korea to be a partner of some way. You know, doesn't have to be an active partner. Yes, the emperor will demand from King Injo and Korea at times military assistance in fighting the Ming. All right, not a lot, but there is just the ritual demands that the Manchu demand of Korea to take part in this and to recognize the Manchu as the power in Northeast Asia now. And that's what the Manchu want. So it's a practical, from the Manchu perspective, it's practical. From the Korean perspective, it's humiliating, understandably. And I think these dramas probably put a lot of time and money in, you know, recreating the costumes and trying to get historical accuracy down. So yeah, I would say probably pretty close.
Very good.
Uh,
Thank you.
Christina Kaltenbach, you had your hand up. Do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. I was just gonna ask quickly about the value or status of these kind of diaries, because we have quite a lot of them. And what do you think, how literal we can take the information from these diaries, or what things we might need to be cautious of when working with them?
That's a very scholarly question. Very good. Of course, Namhan and other diaries, they are one source of this tale. And something that I point out in my introduction is that Namhan is telling one side of the story, and it's a story that he is trying to retell for different purposes. So it's, the historical accuracy, of course, it's historically accurate because he's writing it, and he's writing it the time that he's living it. But in terms of veracity, right, it's a different question. We have to, a diary like this, you have to take in context with other sources at the time, like the Shilluk, for example, is a really good one. But as I also discuss in the introduction, this is the most complete diary, but there are other diaries too, whether they're, writings, brief writings, or similar narrative style writings of the incident at this time too. So you have to kind of coordinate and angulate to make sure that you're telling a story. But yes, certainly you have to be cautious of writers in the diaries, and bring that forward as part of the narrative of understanding. Is don't trust what he is saying and why he's trying to say it. Look, doubt it, and ask questions. I think is a really good way of approaching text like this in any sort of historical source.
Great, important question. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Our time is almost up. I have one last question that we're going to have time for, and I'm going to go back to Igor. He has another question that he'd like to ask. So Igor, you've got not quite the last word, but close to it. George will have almost the last word.
Thank you. So in previous question, you mentioned, that Namhan. So I'm sorry for no face reveal, and I'm sorry for not reading your book yet. Yeah, and so you mentioned factionalism, that Namhan suffered a little bit from factionalism in the court. So talking about factionalism and war, yeah. So how badly did it affect, interwar mobilization, if I may? Yeah. So in 1627, they are going back to Ming from Manchus, right? So at that point, they are expecting some consequences, I guess. So how badly did the factionalism in the court, in the eyes of Namhan, affect war mobilization, war construction, fortresses, walls, restoration, etc., etc.? Thank you.
Thanks, Igor.
Thank you, Igor. Factionalism is a tricky business because on the one hand, it's often blamed for the failures of the Chosŏn dynasty. But on the other, I think we have to look past those sort of excuses at other issues, because Chosŏn dynasty, like every country, has factional issues. They're used differently, like whether it's political parties or arguments among different politicians. Factionalism in the interwar years, 1627, 1637, I would have to say is not the real reason for the failures for Chosŏn to prepare properly for 1637. What we see here, though, is that even earlier than that, the group that comes to power and the coup that brings in Injo is a certain factional arrangement that is very much pro-Ming. And so on the one hand, the pro-Ming politicians may be the ones where you can, if you're looking for blame here, although I don't think we should look for blame, and we shouldn't try to put those sort of values on this rate. Now instead just try to understand it. And factionalism is there constantly. Factionalism is there in good ways, and factionalism is there in bad ways. Factionalism intensified after 1637. Factionalism present in the 1620s and 30s. It was there before. So I just would like to say simply, I can't blame factionalism for what happens in the 1620s and 1630s.
Okay. Well, our time is up. We could just have a fascinating discussion all the rest of the night and all day long in Syracuse, and just have a lot of fun. But we have to bring it to a close. George, thank you so much for the ungodly hour that you joined us. We really appreciate it. Folks, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have our next lecture. It's on Tuesday, February 9th at 7:30 p.m. We'll be joined by Ambassador John Everard from the UK. Ambassador Everard served several years as Britain's ambassador to Pyongyang. His memoir, Only Beautiful Please, talks about life in a country that is, as John puts it, a conundrum. And so we'll look forward to seeing you then. Hope that you can join us. And I bid you all a good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Steve, for hosting.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thanks.